All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you've chosen to be here with us, whether it's morning, afternoon, or whatever time of day it is for you. We're thrilled that you've chosen to be here with us. My name is Megan Pollock. My pronouns are she or they, and I am the founder of Engineer Inclusion, and we're a consulting firm. And we have the privilege of getting to work with organizations, industry, and institutions of learning to intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organization. And today I'm really excited to be joined by a couple of my colleagues and friends to talk about something that just sort of came up in our conversations, and that's talking about accent bias. And so today, what we hope to do is to have an interactive panel discussion with you. And so we're going to be able to sort of share our perspectives. We invite you to share yours. We've prepared some strategies for you. I've added a link into the chat for you. And then based on what we learned today, we've got some Slido polls that we're going to use to engage you in this conversation as well. If we get some additional strategies, I'll add those to the website. So really this is meant to sort of for us to co-create this space together. And so we're going to give you a chance to introduce yourselves. And while you're doing that, I want to introduce you to my colleagues, Donna Durbin with Clear English Coach, and my classmate and friend, Dr. Hoda Hassan from the Hill College. So Hoda, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you to join us today.
Sure. Thanks, Megan, for having me. And as Megan said, Megan and I were classmates at Purdue when she graduated from her PhD when I joined the program, but we got to know each other and we kept in touch. And now I'm at the Hill School as the Director of Engineering and Design and the Chair of Computer Science and Engineering program. And why I chose to be here today, it's really, this is my life. I experience accent bias all the time. And I speak English with an accent, and I do recognize that I do have internalized biases, as well as I face external biases. So I'm here just to share my experience and my thoughts on what accent bias is.
Thank you so much, Hoda. Glad that you're here with us. And Donna, welcome.
Hi, Megan and Hoda. I'm delighted to be here. I met Megan in a TWU panel discussion and was so interested in inclusion and diversity because I work with non-native English speakers. I've taught ESL at University of Houston for many years and have studied about 6 different languages, and traveled. So I've recognized personally my difference with being able to speak clearly and be understood. So my role in this performance actually feels like a more practical approach. I work with my individuals who want to improve their speaking for presentations, to be understood clearly, to equalize the playing field so that they feel like they got the confidence and can do their job to the very best of their ability. So I'm delighted to be a part of this panel as well. Oh, you're muted, Megan.
Oh, thanks. So TWU, for those of you who don't know, is Texas Women's University, and that's where I did my undergraduate in computer science. So we've got a few people who are chiming in on the Slido here, and Caitlin and Drea, it's great to see you here both. And Caitlin, I'm with you, right? So, the notion of accent bias is something that I learned about when I was really young. So I am a Southerner, and I grew up in Southeast Texas. And I remember when I was a freshman in high school, I had met this woman, and she had advised me to lose my Southern accent. And I was like, but why? It's who I am, right? And she said, if you want to be anyone in this world, you cannot have that Southern accent because people are going to think you're stupid. They're not going to respect you. And little did I know that as much as I was really proud of my Southern identity at that time, I took it really serious. And I have worked to really reduce my Southern accent. Now, the joke is I just moved back to where I grew up. after being gone 21 years. So y'all can tell me later if I pick up all those Southern accents again. But the difference is for me as a white woman, even if I have a Southern accent, the benefit that I have is the privilege that comes with my skin color, right? Privilege I didn't earn. And so even though we may have biases based on how people speak, even if they're not English language learners, based on their sort of regional accents, we know that the impact of accent, this prejudice of anyone based on how they speak, has a great impact on people and how they can move through this world. And so as we enter in this conversation, I want to make sure we sort of frame how we talk about this in a couple of key ways. First is that we want to make sure that we are not making any generalizations, right? We don't want to generalize whole populations of people because people are different and we can't speak about people in monoliths. Second, we want to make sure that we are using an asset focus. Even though we're talking about an accents and that people have something, it doesn't mean that they lack anything, right? It doesn't mean that we need to fix them. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. We just want to make sure that as we approach this conversation that we are honoring people for the value and the beauty that they bring to the diversity of our teams. And then the last thing that we want to keep in mind is this intersectional approach. And I introduced that just a moment ago of talking about, even though I may have had a Southern accent, the intersection of that identity with my racial identity as a white woman is going to be different than the intersection of identities and intersection of experiences of someone like Hoda, right? So as someone who is an immigrant to this country, her experiences are going to be different than mine. And we have to acknowledge that, right? And so, when I think about my experiences with accent bias, it's going to be different than Hoda's based on the constructs of power, based on privilege, and all that is a part of that. And so we want to keep those three things in mind: non-generalizations, intersectional focus, and then an asset mindset and how we move through this conversation. Sound good? All right, so we've got some other introductions here. Just want to acknowledge. So Greg, he sees that his accent is more of a benefit of a problem. And so I'm going to make some assumptions of your gendered identity. So as a man, that might influence you in a way that it wouldn't influence me, right? So we're looking at these intersections of identity and how it affects us. We've got Yolanda from Mount Vernon in Chicago. You're interested in any way to promote equity. We've got Kirk from Louisiana. Chose to attend because he wants to be intentional with his interactions and identifying our unintentional biases. We've got Eva. Hi, Eva. Just observed this issue of accent bias. Hi, Wilma. Good to have you here. Hi, Mark. So Mark, you work with English language learners and you hear and witness accent bias frequently. We've got Frederick joining from Sacramento, committed to language justice and looking forward to learning how to combat accent bias. So we're so glad that y'all are here. We're going to use this Slido tool. If you're new to Slido, you can I recommend using like the camera on your phone. And then it's the same QR code for every screen. So you won't have to reload it. It'll just refresh with every question. And so the questions that I'm going to offer to Hoda and Donna, I'm going to put the same questions up there for y'all so that you're part of this conversation and part of what we are all doing and learning together. And so, hey, Jennifer, I see you just popped in. I'm grateful that you're here. So to start us off, let's talk about what is accent bias. So Hoda, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think accent bias is to start off the conversation?
Sure. Yeah, when I think about accent bias, I'm really thinking about those discriminatory and judgmental behaviors and even attitudes against someone who speaks a language, let's say English here, with an accent, which I think the process for me is automatically categorizing people into what we perceive to be their social status, their background, or even considering them as less or more in many ways, especially intellectually. This is how I define it for myself.
And to add on to that, tell me, what does it feel like to experience accent bias? You and I have talked a little bit about this. What does it feel like?
Sure. I mean, it has different characteristics when you experience it. It really depends on how you experience it, where you experience it, in what context or settings you experience it. But for me, it always comes with this, I should call it maybe self-confidence barrier, that as soon as I start speaking, especially if I'm in a room with people who I assume they all are native language speakers, I do start thinking about my accent as a barrier, and unconsciously or even consciously, I start thinking about how are they going to perceive me? Are they going to take me serious, what I'm saying seriously, or are they going to look at me as someone less than them? Even especially in the settings that I interact with, the people I interact with, we're usually talking about something intellectually research or work or education related. And to me is I'm always very uncautiously grateful that I have a PhD and a doctor at the beginning of my name. So I feel like that can help me with my confidence, but definitely it comes with that self-confidence. It really impacts my self-confidence, as I feel like people are perceiving me as different or less than others. And I should acknowledge that this is more, it has been impacted by external biases, with the behaviors that I witnessed and experienced firsthand, but it is an internalized bias too. It's something that I have internalized it in my mind, in myself, that, okay, you have an accent, people may perceive you as less, and you have to work on your accent. Your accent is important. Try to pronounce the word correctly. This is all what I have internalized, of course, based because of my experience in the US, but it is difficult to live with an accent.
Yeah, thanks so much for describing that, Hoda. And what I heard and what you're saying is, you talked about the sort of barrier that it creates for you. You talked about how it's a conscious and an unconscious thing that's happening as you sort of move through the world. And this connects to stereotype threat, right? The risk of confirming a stereotype about some identity that you have, right? And so whether that is a stereotype that people with accents aren't smart, or people with accents aren't, insert whatever kind of thing, when we have that sort of stereotype threat, which is an internalized oppression, as you mentioned, right? It can unconsciously jam our cognitive bandwidth and how we perform, right? It becomes a shadow job. It's the shadow job of like, can I function in this space? And by just being myself, am I going to sort of represent the what I want to represent? Am I going to reinforce some kind of stereotypes? And so, we're going to talk a little bit later about how internalized bias, how internalized oppression really happens, because it's not the fault of the person, right? It's the fault of the systems. So I want to look here at the screen. We've got some great contributions from our participants. We've got xenophobia right here, big. And so for those of you who don't know what that means, it's a dislike or a prejudice against people from other countries. And so yes, this is deeply rooted in much of the accent bias that we experience, this sort of unconscious ideology or a conscious ideology, the belief that somebody doesn't belong here, and how that then affects how we interact with others. So we've got other comments around it's an unjustified discrimination, a belief that you don't talk like I do, so you must not be very bright, judging someone based on how well or not well they speak a certain language, thinking that people aren't trustworthy, stereotypes, ableism, sexism, all these kinds of isms. And so all of these isms are these big oppressions, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. So I want to ask Donna here, I want to get you to share with us. So you work with people who come to you with a desire to work on their elocution, to address some of the accents that they may have. And so tell us, what have you observed in your clients? Like, how have you noticed accent bias affects them?
Most of my clients, actually, one of the most common terms they use is they feel uncomfortable. They feel like they don't have any confidence. And that doesn't have to do with their intelligent level, their technical expertise, all of that. It really is affected by when someone asks them where they're from, or they have to repeat themselves multiple times. And so many of them are feeling like it's their accent that's the problem. I find that that's not always the case. A lot of times that self-confidence is basically because of a cultural difference, or because that they're just new and they don't know maybe it's a new job. But a lot of times when they recognize, and I interview everybody because I tell them we all have accents. I have an accent. There's nothing wrong with an accent, but if you cannot pronounce words correctly and you're having to repeat yourself, then of course that's got to be frustrating for you and for the listener. And there are skills that you can learn, just like when you have to go to the gym and work out to get in shape. There are things you can do to simple things that can actually improve your presentation, your delivery, so that your voice and the way you speak comes across with more confidence and more presence, so that you can do that. So most of the time I will tell people, when I understand them clearly and as we start to talk together, I recognize that they're just uncomfortable speaking in front of other people, which is one of the number one fears, is public speaking. So a lot of times that just takes practice. It's not due to their accent. And I'll tell them, I understand you perfectly well. That's part of who you are. You're never going to completely lose an accent. I can slip into a more Southern accent. I've lived in the South all of my life, but it does make a difference if I pronounce words that my listeners can't hear. You have to pay attention to who your audience is and recognize ways that you can slow down and speak more clearly. But it's the confidence and the feeling like they don't fit in. They feel like they're being discriminated against, whether other people are being promoted and they're not. So it affects their career. It affects their earning capability. Many times they earn probably $20,000 less a year, because if their communication skills are not, their soft skills are not enhanced or better. But that's something even English speakers have to work on.
Yeah. Well, I am on a mission in this life to move us towards saying professional skills instead of soft skills, because communication is an absolute professional skill. There's nothing soft about it, right? So we want to help people to build those skills. Something I think about too is, and we've got some good conversation going on in the chat about, when people comment on your accents, and it made me think about, so I speak some Spanish, and I've noticed, and over the years of whether I'm traveling, whether I'm speaking with people who are, working, around my home, I'll speak Spanish, and everybody thinks I speak excellent Spanish. Listen, folks, I don't, right? I do not speak excellent Spanish. But the difference is the sort of expectation and the sort of level of power, right? And so it's often made me think, why do I get to be, oh, look at the white American who's learning to speak Spanish, and I get somehow glorified, but the people who are learning multiple languages here in our country don't get that same grace, right? And it's because of power and privilege, right? It's because of all of those words that you all shared on the previous Slido about xenophobia, about these sort of expectations of belonging and stereotypes and all of these things. And so we have to think about the ways in which we're interacting with others. How are we communicating, and how are we helping to bridge that gap? Donna brought up in one of our earlier conversations the sort of importance of, like, communication is a two-way street. If we're just expecting people who are learning English or who are not native English speakers to come to our level, what are we doing to meet them where they are, right? And so how are we really learning to do that? So I want to acknowledge some of, go ahead.
Let me jump in there real quickly, because I want to remind all of the people that call me and want to talk with me, to work with me, is that most Americans do not speak a second language. They have no idea the challenges and the hours and years that you have spent learning a second or third language. So part of that is to give them the credit of really, you've got the capabilities, much more so than Americans. We would not function very well in another country. We're spoiled. We're fortunate that English is the world business language. So you're right. I give them credit. They need to give themselves credit for all the skills that they've learned.
Yeah. Some great conversation happening on the Slido poll and also in the chat. So Hoda, tell us a little bit more about what you were adding here in the chat.
Sure. Awat, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, she shared that when Americans, or in general native language speakers, facilitate our accents or try to correct our accent, or even make some comments, how she has this mixed feelings. She says, I don't know if I should be flattered by this or worried that this is linked to some biases. And this is what I shared. I totally agree with her. I get mixed feelings when some people acknowledge my accent. Again, it really depends on who acknowledges it and when and where. But mostly, really, I do feel that I do have that mixed feelings that, okay, I don't know if you mean to hurt me or you mean to help me, but why should you even acknowledge that here? I did honestly, one of my good mentors that I really appreciate and respect, once they told me that they think that I'm brilliant, and but they don't want others to have perceptions around me and something like that, and they are happy to support me with any professional development to help my accent. I know that was meant to be a nice comment, a supportive comment, but it really hurt. It did hurt me, and for a while, I lost all my confidence in speaking English, just because I knew I have an accent. They really, for a few times, they said, I hope that I didn't mean bad. I'm really trying to support you. I know how brilliant you are, but it didn't help, right? Because it was really, they were really pointing out to something that came as a weakness to me, and talking about the asset base, even though they mentioned that I'm brilliant, the bot after that really ruined all of it for me. So I do get that mixed feelings now anytime when people point to my accent, even those times that it comes as a compliment. I had a comment just a few months ago from a beloved colleague, and I'm really saying that because I do love them and I know that they mean good and they're not meant to hurt me, but that's when microaggression comes and play a role. They told me, can you pronounce this word again? I was like, what? And then they said, I felt like you said it in a very nice way. It was interesting. It was cute. And I was like, okay, no, I'm not going to pronounce it again. This is not cute for me. And really, it really comes when we talk about accent bias. It's happening, even if it's happening in a sweet way, or as they call it, cute way. But it hurts many people, including me.
Yeah, so Hoda, I can imagine, like, and from what you're describing, it's not just the one comment, it's the accumulation of all the comments, right? So all the sort of micro aggressive, whether well-intentioned or not, statements, how they add up to and then ultimately affect your own self-efficacy in speaking English, or in doing whatever it is that you do, because you are brilliant, by the way. And so all of these things accumulate. I love this sort of example. There's a great video on microaggressions as mosquito bites. And so if you haven't seen that, definitely Google like microaggressions, mosquito bites. It'll come up, and I'll try to remember to put it on the resource page as well. But it's basically saying like one mosquito bite is like not that big of a deal, but when you get 1,000, it could really push someone to a breaking point, you know? And so it's thinking about the sort of impact of these kinds of things. I want to draw our attention to the chat. So we've got a question from Caitlin saying that so she has a mid-Atlantic US accent, and she's had students complain to her as their advisor about professors who are non-native English speakers and how they, quote, can't learn anything from them because they can't understand them. So her question is what can I say to these students to acknowledge their struggle, but also highlight that they may need to adjust their listening or their approach to their class? Hoda or Donna, any responses you want to share to that?
I'm sorry, I was I was reading the comments and I got distracted. So
That's okay. The question here, I'll drop it back in the chat here. So what can we say to students to acknowledge the struggle that they may be facing with professors who they think, they're not able to understand, so that they can learn to adjust their listening and their approach to the class?
Well, one of the things I believe that as English speakers, we use an awful lot of idioms and cultural phrases that are not relatable or even translatable to other cultures. And so in a way, if we could speak with more plain English, instead of dropping all these phrasal verbs and words that don't make sense to other cultures, that would help us appreciate the fact that they are different. And yet learning, and yet we can actually communicate more clearly. That's one of the complaints that, or one of the questions I ask a lot of my students. How long have they been in the United States? Have they adjusted to some of those idioms? I have a little book there's 2,500 idioms that we use on a common everyday basis. And that's not even all of them, because when I look through that book, there's even more. So part of it is learning to adjust to the fact that they don't have the same background experience that we do. We have to be able to be more conscious of the fact that we've got a diverse group of people that are here to learn and support them and help them.
I'm really thinking about this question. And I don't have an answer for it now, because I'm trying to put myself in the professor's shoe and think about if a colleague of mine approaches me telling me my students may not understand my accent, how do I feel? But then at the same time, thinking about myself as a student of a class that I cannot understand the teacher's accent, the professor's accent, how do I feel about that? I think it's for me, it's again a matter of who tells me, how they tell me, and I just don't know how. There were times that I was more proactive myself to ask people how you pronounce this, or this word, or can one of the students please read this text for me? I can't myself. But that was me being proactive and acknowledging that it's fine to have accent. It's fine to not be able to pronounce a word or spell out a word, because English is not my first language. But again, coming from a colleague, I just don't know how that would feel. And again, and I think it's the same for professors who do not understand students' accent too. When they are here to help students, but then they cannot understand their accent. Yeah, I don't really know how to
Yes.
address this.
Something I'm thinking about, and Caitlin, I bet you're already doing this, is to one, acknowledge with empathy, like, I hear you. I acknowledge that it's probably really hard to understand. But then to something we talked about earlier, like a professional skill that, and so I happen to know that Caitlin teaches engineering. So like as a professional skill, as an engineer in the workforce, we need to know how to talk to people, right? So we need to learn how to listen. And so really challenge them to say, like, if you want to build your listening skills, because by the way, like listening is a skill. I have a resource here on my website on listening. And then I've got several like recorded tools on like how to be an active listener. And so when we begin to really employ active listening practices, just like Tiana Andrews said in the chat a few minutes ago, she said that, you know, her doctor's from another culture and she had to adjust to how she listens to him. And now after 20 years of being his patient, she understands everything as if it was normal, right? And so that's what we have to encourage our students to do, is to hang in there, right? Like, don't leave. You know, we don't want to push them out. We want to help them really think about, how do I become a better listener? How do I learn how to ask the right questions? And so, you know, one of the things that we've also talked about is this sort of notion of learning how to ask, hey, I didn't catch that. Would you mind saying it again?
Mhm.
And
I ask my clients to encourage to not be afraid to ask for clarification and to ask the English speaker to explain themselves, because many times they themselves feel inadequate to ask the question for clarification when they don't understand an English speaker. And I tell them not all English speakers speak clearly either. A lot of people mumble, or they are saying it under their breath and it doesn't come across. But most of the non-native English speakers feel hesitant, like they can't ask that question. So I tell them, ask them, speak up and say, do I need to speak? Do I need to say it again? Do you understand? You know, give yourself that option to be able to get that two-way street of communication going.
yeah. Yeah, and that's certainly a skill. And I don't know about y'all, but I certainly did not learn in any class on like how to be a good listener, right?
No.
So that's something we have to learn, a practice and a skill that we can develop. So hopefully that is going to be helpful. It's not going to solve the problem immediately. It's just going to hopefully empower them to be thoughtful to how they're treating others, right? Because, you know, as you know, Hoda has shared about her experience as, you know, a non-native English speaker, or as an English speaker to your, how you describe speaking with an accent. Any subtle micro message could have a really big impact. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to send those. So if I can be aware, if I can be really thoughtful to how I engage with others, I want to reduce the ways in which those kinds of interactions show up. So I want us to move to the next question, and thinking about, why do we have accent bias? And to talk a little bit about sort of the bigger picture and the setting of how these things come about. And so when we think about accent bias, I'm going to flip forward to, when we think about accent bias, we talked a little bit about the sort of an internalized nature of bias. And I am a big fan of this 4 eyes of oppression model. And so with them being ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. And the way that I like to frame this is this model that I've drafted here, is to recognize that there are 3 forms of external oppression. Those are the ideological oppressions that exist. And so these ideologies, it's the foundation of the 4 eyes. It's the idea that one group is superior to another. And so these ideologies, they create a dominant narrative about a group, an us versus them culture, which is absolutely what often happens when it comes to an accent bias. And then these ideologies, they become played out in how we communicate, right? These interpersonal interactions. So it's what's happening between me and you, what's happening between you and your students, what's happening between you and your colleagues, what's happening between you and the people around you in your neighborhood. And these interpersonal interactions, they're how those ideologies are played out in daily interactions, whether they are intentional or unintentional. And so this includes implicit biases, those micro messages, whether we are perpetuating or not interrupting stereotypes, or not recognizing power and privilege. And so these interpersonal interactions then are embedded within our institutions. And so institutional oppression, this creates a system of invisible barriers that limit people based on their membership in certain social identity groups. So if we're talking about people who have some kind of accent, then it can be barriers that are invisible to those who are seemingly unaffected to it. So I may not notice those barriers if I don't have an accent that's not being privileged within that space, right? And so institutional oppression, it occurs when established laws, customs, practices systematically reflect and reproduce those inequities based on membership in some kind of group, right? And so examples of this are like when, let me think of an example specifically related to institutional bias, when there is intense amounts of readings with no options to do that. So Hoda and her colleagues wrote a paper called Capturing the Experiences of ESL graduate students in engineering education. And so in this paper, she and her colleagues write about this sort of immense amount of readings in a doctoral program. And so how rigid are we to some of these kinds of things? And what ways are we providing accessibility to other kinds of ways? If those are institutionalized policies that say this is the only way of doing this, then we are privileging those people for whom we're privileging those people for whom it is easier to do. So the next thing is then the result of the ideologies, the interpersonal, the institutional, they then affect individuals. So again, it's so important that we notice and recognize that oppression always begins from the outside of the oppressed group. But by the time it gets internalized, the external oppression need hardly be felt because the damage is already done, right? If you've already internalized these ideas, then it can begin to lead to feelings of like self-hate, believing negative messaging, powerlessness, and despair. And so when we think about this, we need to, and how we address this, how we reduce accent bias, how we reduce any kind of bias, is we have to address it at all 4 levels. We have to address the ideologies, we have to be thoughtful to our interactions, we have to be aware of the ways in which we are complicit in the structures of our system, so that we can then support people who have perhaps internalized some of these ideas. And so that's a little bit of a big sort of structure of how accent bias comes to be. But let's open it up to Hoda and Donna, some thoughts here in the chat and the Slido, talking about why do you think we have accent bias? So we talked a little bit about this. Some of you already mentioned that with like stereotypes and xenophobia and things like that. But what else can you think of? Hoda, Donna, what are you thinking about?
Sure. In comment, Neda wrote something about which I really liked. I'm happy if she wants to share it as well. But she writes about the intersection of culture here and the nationality. She talks about, in her experience, how being an Iranian has been different for her than being her friends who are from somewhere else, like Europe, and how the accent bias is more heavier against being from Middle East and Middle Eastern countries, especially those countries that are not really represented well in our media, in the US media, and then how that is different when they come from a country that it's better represented in our media, and how that plays a big role. I think that's something that really it is an intersectionality between the culture, how we perceive a group of people, and now if this group of people are speaking with this certain accent, that turns to a bias against their accent. But it's really more, and it's beyond their accent. It's really, we're talking about a whole culture, we're talking about whole nationality, that we have biases around them.
I would
Yeah,
agree
thanks.
with that. Part of again is I believe the fact that most Americans do not speak a second language, so they don't recognize the amount of work and education and level of practice that it takes to speak a second language and function in a country that is not your own. I lived in Thailand for 2 years, and I've sold everything and went to live in Thailand for 2 years because I wanted the experience of being in another country. And I think it came full force to me when I was trying to say the word for silver, which I could not say in Thai. And no matter how often or how many different ways I tried to say it, they kept telling me, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. At the same time, I had been teaching speaking and listening at U of H. And this was what I recognized. Oh, my students struggle with this. I know what the word is, but I can't say it. And they can't explain to me how to say it. And I realized how early this is an unconscious ability to say certain sounds that your muscles develop when you're a child, and it becomes an unconscious, like really muscle coordination and control. So when I came back to the States was when I recognized that a lot of my students had the reading, the writing, the grammar, the vocabulary. It was actually this development of their basically primitive brain that did not develop the same tongue coordination and control to speak. So when I explain this to the English speakers and try to bring up, like, ask them, how do you say this? Where's your tongue? They can't explain it. They don't know either, because it really starts at a very, small, young age, and it's unconscious. So to me, that lack of travel, the lack of interest in other cultures, for me, that's been, gosh, the diversity is what makes me fascinated with the world and other cultures. And so anytime I've traveled, I try to learn some of that language to be able to communicate and know to connect with other people. To me, it's about connection.
That's beautiful. It certainly is about connection and the opportunity to connect. I want to draw our attention to the Slido and acknowledge some of the contributions of our participants. So we've got right there, big in the middle, nationalism. We've got internalized caste system of beliefs, limited world experiences, racism, tribalism, limited worldviews, white supremacy, media scapegoating. I think it jumbled before I got that last one. Lack of knowledge, I think, is what it was. And so again, thinking about how all of these things manifest, and what I love about what Donna said is, like, allowing us to have a little bit of grace with people, right? I think I also didn't recognize how hard English was until I started to learn some other languages. And you're right, like, our tongues, if we haven't learned how to move our mouths in those kinds of ways, it is very hard. When we look at, if you've ever spent any time with little kids who are learning to speak, they will they'll watch your mouth and how your mouth is moving.
Exactly.
And they're trying to mimic that, right? And it's harder for us as adults to do that. This is why they say teach, multiple languages to kids, because their brains are ready for that. And so again, we have so many different ways in which accent biases happen. So I want us to move now to thinking about what are some strategies, what are some specific strategies to reduce accent bias and to be more inclusive. And so I'm going to leave the Slido up so y'all can contribute, but I want to pull up also the website and point us to some of the things there. And so again, to be more inclusive, Donna's already pointed out that we can reduce the use of it for English speakers to be more inclusive, reduce the use of idioms, acronyms, and nostalgia, like in the sort of pop culture. Hoda, I think you mentioned that. Do you want to talk a little bit about why the nostalgia in pop culture is kind of important to reduce?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for those who did not grow up here, let's say in this country, we're talking about the US, and let's have the US as the base. Sometimes we cannot make connections with those internal jokes or stories, or even some sentences that people use. Let's say a phrase that comes from a movie in 90s. I didn't grow up in the US, so I don't know what movie you all have been watching in 90s. And when some certain words or phrases come up from those movies without having any references, it's very hard for me to understand what you all are talking about. I don't have the context that you all share. The nostalgia, it's not there for me. And for someone who struggles with believing that I'm worthy of being here, I deserve to be in this country, I am contributing to this country, it's sometimes hard when I hear that and I'm in those contexts that I don't have any reference to it, suddenly it hits me hard, that thinking about, oh, I can't even contribute here. I don't even understand what these people are talking about. So for me, one of the strategies that had helped me, I have become again more proactive and more courageous to ask what you're talking about. But many have not become that courageous as or do not feel really comfortable asking. So to me, what has helped was when you are talking about something that it has nostalgia for you, or it refers to something that you have as your childhood, it's a memory, refer to it. Say that, oh, I'm talking about this movie that we have all watched it in 90s. It was a well-known movie. It was a well-known song, or it was a singer it was a popular singer. And then I can make that connection, or I can understand why I'm not making that connection.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Hoda. Yeah, so when we reduce the use of idioms, acronyms, or nostalgia, we can also normalize the questioning of them, right? And so, asking and clarifying, even if you might know what it is, go ahead and ask, because there's probably somebody who doesn't know, right? Like,
Right.
what movie you're talking about? Oh, I don't know about that one. Or what's the acronym mean again? And so just normalize asking those kinds of questions. The
I
next
remind,
tip, oh, go
so I
ahead.
was going to say on that note, I remind my clients that every profession has its own vocabulary. And if you're a doctor and you're using all these terms with me, I don't necessarily understand what you're meaning. If you're an engineer and you reference those things. So usually my clients can talk to other people within their same profession. It's when they're trying to step outside of that profession and have general conversations or just casual conversations with people, they seem to struggle more. So I remind them, your vocabulary is something you've learned that's specialized. And I don't necessarily know all of it, but I'm always learning when you share it with me. So part of that is to recognize that is a very specialized vocabulary. Wanted to talk a little bit about that indirect and direct uses of phrases, because I know when I was in Thailand, they are known as a country of smiles, and they will never tell you no. They do not have a word for no. So part of this is trying to learn the body language or the smile. There's like 14 different smiles, and you're supposed to be able to read that. I did not know this until our tour guide had mentioned this, and it was like bizarre to me. But I realized that's why Americans come off as so blunt and so, well, maybe, if you compare, don't want to generalize, but we do, pretty much say yes or no. And we don't beat around the bush as often. So when I work with people that are not able to give me a clear answer, I realize that there's a cultural difference in what they consider to be polite or, respectful. And that's one of the things is if we had more trainings in other cultures and what that was, how that was seen as respect or not, direct or indirect, it would help them adjust and it would help us adjust.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we could hold a whole another conversation and workshop on just communicating across cultures outside of accent bias, right?
Right.
So thanks for that. That's a good idea for another topic. So I want to go over a few more strategies. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. If you've got chat questions, you can start adding those in the chat, and we're going to get to those. So I was starting here. So the next one on this list is to acknowledge the labor that learners face in the sort of code switching. And what we mean by code switching is a sort of sometimes conscious and unconscious behavior to sort of learning how to switch between the expectations of different environments. And so when we recognize the labor that people face in this, it gives us an opportunity to be more inclusive and have more grace. So strategies for all of us: use the audio recording features like LinkedIn's to help others pronounce your name. So like if you go to LinkedIn, there's instructions on how to do this here on my website. But like if you go to the page here, there's an audio recording that you can do,
Megan,
on like how to pronounce your name. I use this a lot to learn how to pronounce people's names. I also have it on my website. So I have like just a little, MP4 file, MP3 file, whatever, to allow somebody to kind of look here and play it.
Megan
And so
Pollock.
again, we're trying to normalize the ways in which we learn how to pronounce people's names. So if you do it, then you can encourage other people to do it. When it comes to people's names, I've got a whole web post on how to learn how to say people's names correctly. And so it should go without saying that it is important for us to say people's names correctly. And if you're having trouble getting it right, ask them, say, will you help me get it right? I want to learn how to get it right. I often, if there's a name that I can't find, if they don't have a recording, like I've posted on my website, I will go to YouTube. There are tons of instructions on like how to pronounce people's names. If it's a name that my tongue struggles with saying, I will often, before I see them, I'll save the link on their contact so I can go to YouTube and like practice it before I see them, because that's important to me. Because again, we're trying to drive that connection. We want to normalize asking, hey, could you say that one more time? I didn't quite get it. We talked about how communication is a two-way street. You can read the post here about listening. So on the listening, I have this strategy. I've got some exercises and some additional tools on like what the different sort of levels of listening are. So I encourage you to explore those resources. And
Megan,
then,
Megan, let me
Yeah.
break in. Is this on your website or is this on your
Yeah.
blog post? Where would
This
we
is-
find this?
This is on the resources that let's see.
I just want to make sure I have a record of that because that's great information.
Yeah, so there it is, right there in the resource page. And this is also where I'm going to save the recording of this session. So if you want to come back and access it, I'll put it here on this page. So I also have some resources on like learning to say people's names correctly and how you can do this. So you can check that out there. So now let's go back here. I want to pull out a couple of questions from the chat. So Noelle says, years ago, I was part of a hiring committee for a first grade teacher, and you confess that you were conflicted when thinking about whether a particular candidate's accent might make it harder for some of the emergent readers to learn sound letter word correspondence. How might such hiring committees do a better job of countering accent bias? So one of the things that comes to mind here is just the mindset switch of like, is that a value add or is it a deficit, right? What if we think about the opportunity for emergent readers to be exposed to different elocutions? How would that help their development positively rather than negatively? I don't know the research of whether it does or doesn't, but I think for us as a hiring committee, we have to ask ourselves, like, are we perpetuating the ways of knowing and doing and being that have been the norm, the status quo? Or are we thinking outside of that and learning to value and celebrate differences and seeing what they bring to the space rather than what they might take away?
I think just remembering that I saw a tweet a few months ago. I really liked that. It said, we need to remember that accent is not a measure of intellectual ability. I think this is something that we have to keep remembering, that the person, even if they have accent, they may not be a good teacher for teaching how kids can read books in English accent and American accent, but they have different values. They have other values that our kids can learn from them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me think about I was an au pair. I lived in Spain years ago, teaching two little beautiful half Spanish, half Italian girls English. And before I flew out, I was 22 or 23, something like that. The mom wanted to speak to me because she wanted to see if I had a deep Southern accent, because she didn't want her girls to learn a deep Southern accent, right? So she was worried that I would be teaching them the wrong kind of English. I passed mustard, but again, the truth is what about the value that I could bring rather than if I said y'all a little bit too much, We do have one more question in the chat from Bo. He says, would it be okay to learn about other cultures with food? I mean, yes, right? Like, why not? I think there are lots of ways to learn about other cultures. Certainly, food is a communal way of bringing people together. And so that is usually an easy way to get people to talk. Some more strategies here shared on the Slido: attend cultural festivals, watch, listen to film produced by people with accents different from your own, ask people to listen to everyone's accent and have a competition to see who can pick the most. Okay, guarantee the foreigners will run rings around the locals. Interesting. Pause before reacting, reflect and choose compassionate response, actually listen. Education, make a conscious effort to learn and understand what we're unfamiliar with, and then watch foreign films if travel isn't possible. These are really great examples. So I want to thank you all so much for coming today. If you are willing, you can go to my website and fill out a little evaluation for us. It's engineerinclusion.com/thanks, and I'm going to drop that here in the chat for you. I value your feedback, and I'm just realizing as panelists, Donna and Hoda may not be on there, but you can still provide some feedback for us, and this is how we can improve. There's also a space if you're interested in some other ideas on topics that we can do. Another topic that I have coming up in the next month or so is on bullying in the workplace and how this is tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so I will email all of you with the resources that we've shared today and the recording. And I'm just so grateful that you came to hang out with us for an hour today. Hoda, Donna, anything else that you'd like to share?
Oh, there's always so much to say. I'm just delighted that to have an opportunity to do this and that so many people did come. I just really am. I really do believe that this is the way to make our world a better place. We've got so many gifts and talents to share, and I don't want to think that our language is the block, is the barrier to it. So I want to thank everybody for coming and your comments. And thanks, Megan, for doing such a fabulous job at facilitating.
You're welcome. Hoda?
Yeah, thanks so much to all of you who came. This topic is very important to me, and I'm glad I was able to talk it out and share my feelings and my experience with you all. And thanks for this space, Megan.
Awesome. Well, I'm so grateful for both of you. It's been so much fun working with you. So until next time, we appreciate y'all. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.